I was given the type of disease, I've turned it around the other way, and by drivers I'm assuming we're talking about the sorts of things that are responsible for the very high rates of rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease in Aboriginal communities. So we're kind of talking about risk factors, and I'll get on to that, but I do want to start by setting the scene with the burden of disease. But even before that, I knew I was going to be the first speaker about rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease. I'm assuming that most of us here understand the disease, but I thought it was important to just give a little bit of an introduction around what this disease is and some of the important things we're trying to sort out with this disease. So just very briefly, this is the sort of thing that many of you are all too familiar with, an X-ray of a young boy or actually an adolescent with rheumatic heart disease. And this is an all too common story of a boy who had multiple recurrences of acute rheumatic fever during his childhood. He did not receive many of his scheduled penicillin injections, which were designed to prevent those recurrences. Each recurrence led to further damage to his heart. He's got a big heart, he's in heart failure, and he died before his 16th birthday. This is the sort of story that we're trying to prevent. So that's the disease we're trying to sort out. It's a disease that is almost exclusively seen in developing countries and in indigenous populations in affluent countries, and it is now a disease that's virtually eliminated from the industrialised or the affluent populations of the world. And we need to try and sort out why we can't do the same in other populations. Just to briefly outline what this disease is, this is an infectious disease. It's a chronic disease, but it's a chronic disease that's caused by an infection, which is relatively uncommon amongst the chronic diseases, although there's obviously lots of hypotheses about the role of infection in many chronic diseases. This one, we know the cause. The cause is this bug over here. It's the Streptococcus, the group A Streptococcus. And we also know that not every Streptococcus has the potential to cause rheumatic fever, so we refer to this concept of so-called rheumatogenic streptococci. We know that if a person is in touch with one of these streptococci, in most instances they'll get an infection and they'll get better. But if you are someone who has some sort of susceptibility, and we also know that not every person is susceptible to rheumatic fever, and I'll get onto that a bit later in my talk, but if you are someone who is susceptible and you encounter one of these particular types of bugs and you get an infection, the question is also where that infection should occur. The classic teaching is that you get an infection of your throat, which might cause you to have a sore throat, or you might not know you've had that infection of your throat. That's the classic teaching, that's the only type of infection that can cause rheumatic fever. As many of you know, we can't explain the high rates of rheumatic fever in the Aboriginal population with that hypothesis, and so our hypothesis is that skin infection with this bug may play a role in causing rheumatic fever. Regardless of that, of the site of infection, if a susceptible host encounters a rheumatogenic group A Streptococcus, gets an infection, then in some of those circumstances, a couple of weeks later, 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks later, they'll get sick. And that's the disease called acute rheumatic fever. It's a fairly disabling acute illness. You get a high temperature, you might get some swollen joints or sore joints, you might get chorea, which is abnormal movements, you might get some abnormalities of your skin, and most importantly, you might get some damage to your heart valves. You'll, in most circumstances, have to go to hospital to get treatment so that you get better. It's symptomatic treatment. It's basically to get the fever and the pain sorted out while your body heals itself. All of those manifestations I talked about get better, with the exception, in many circumstances, of the damage to heart valves. So you may be left, after you recover from acute rheumatic fever, with damage to your heart valves, which might last a period of time, it might last a very long time. The big problem with acute rheumatic fever is that it comes back. So if you've had it once, you are highly susceptible to getting it again when you get another strep infection. And that's the real problem in the Aboriginal population in Australia. High rates of recurrent rheumatic fever, each of which can lead to further damage to your heart valves And that damage to your heart valves is known as rheumatic heart disease. And it means that your heart doesn't function properly, has to pump extra hard, and as a result often fails, and that's why we see the deaths. We see other complications like strokes and heart failure. So that's trying to give you a very brief potted summary of the disease we're talking about today. Okay, let's get on to disease burden. I'm going to show one slide on the burden of disease around the world, but I am assuming that most of you are more interested in the burden of disease in Australia. But we've put a lot of work into this, so I didn't want to ignore it. There's been a considerable effort to try and pull together how much of this disease occurs around the world using existing data. The estimates that we've made are all lower end estimates. In fact, the reality is that the true rates are probably in many circumstances twice as high as this, potentially even more, and we've got some recent data to support that. So consider this the bottom end of the possible true estimates. This is rheumatic heart disease, and these are other sort of rheumatic heart disease related problems. So if you want to look at the figures for rheumatic heart disease, look up there. If you want to look at all the rheumatic heart disease related problems, look down here. And so what we suggest is that currently in the world there are more than 18 million people living with rheumatic heart disease or an associated problem that is not an acute problem that relates to rheumatic heart disease. In terms of new cases each year, about 300,000 new cases of rheumatic heart disease a year, about 640,000 new cases of rheumatic heart disease or its complications such as stroke. And in terms of deaths, 233,000 direct rheumatic heart disease deaths, but if you add in all the other things, including stroke, then we're talking about 350,000 deaths a year. This is a significant number of deaths and cases a year. It means that this is a disease that can't be ignored on the international stage, and we're using this data to advocate for doing something about rheumatic heart disease globally. The key point here is that 95% of these cases, 95% of these deaths occur in developing countries. Obviously, there's a small fraction of the remainder that occur in indigenous populations. The reality is the indigenous populations in affluent countries are small populations, so they're a big problem in those populations. Globally, the disease is focused in developing countries. Okay, let's get on to the Australian data. I've tried to pull together what recent data we have, because we've been using often in these presentations data from 10 years ago. It's pretty important to try and get up-to-date data if you can. And thanks to the wonderful people at the Northern Territory Rheumatic Heart Disease Control Program who've provided terrific data over the last few years. The program's been running now almost 10 years, in fact over 10 years, and has really pulled together a register that allows them to produce reports with fairly reliable, well I think very reliable data. This is the incidence of acute rheumatic fever. So new cases of acute rheumatic fever that occur each year over a 5-year period in the Northern Territory in Aboriginal children in the highest risk age group. This is not the only age group that gets rheumatic fever, this is the highest risk age group. And if you look at the incidence, firstly, these figures are in excess of anything that's been described in any other population in the world, and they point out that about 0.5% of Aboriginal kids, a bit under that, can expect to get rheumatic fever every year. But what was really encouraging, if you look at that, is this trend. And the control program staff really started to get quite excited when we got to 2005, 2006 about, maybe something's working, until we got the 2007 data. So we're not doing a good job at stopping acute rheumatic fever episodes occurring. But what we are starting to get on top of is the whole issue of recurrences. So recurrences, the episodes that occur after someone's already had an episode, are very preventable using penicillin, and we'll hear about that during this meeting. And when we started this back in the late 90s, about 40 to 50% of all episodes of acute rheumatic fever were recurrences in the top end. We're now seeing that down around the 20% mark, and it's fairly consistent. So I would suggest that we're starting to do something in terms of delivering secondary prophylaxis. The Central Australia's, their control program started a few years later, and obviously we need to focus in particular in trying to get secondary prophylaxis delivery better everywhere, but there's obviously a need to focus in the centre, particularly in the Northern Territory. But the real story here is that we are not making a mark in terms of those initial episodes of acute rheumatic fever, and that's something we probably need to talk about, and I'll talk a little bit about it in this talk. Prevalence of rheumatic heart disease, so this is what proportion of the Aboriginal population of all ages is living right now with rheumatic heart disease. I didn't get the data for 2004-2005, but what I think you can see pretty clearly is that there's a steady rise. This is not unexpected. This doesn't mean that we've got an epidemic that's getting out of control of rheumatic heart disease. Most of these are newly detected cases that have been living with rheumatic heart disease for many years. It's just that we now have a control program and we're much better at finding them, registering them, knowing about them. One would hope eventually that we'll start to see a plateau, but that does take a long time because this is a disease that takes many years to develop, and most of these cases would have first developed rheumatic fever 10, 20 years ago. So it's not as though we're necessarily seeing an epidemic of new cases of rheumatic heart disease. One would hope eventually we're going to get this under control. But this is not a sign of failure of the control program, that's the key point. And this is just really to show you that yes, we are picking up new cases of rheumatic heart disease every year in the Northern Territory. Deaths, this was some data over a 10-year period suggesting that there were about 7 directly rheumatic heart disease related deaths per year in the Northern Territory. More recent data suggests that's continuing. So these are people on the register who've died each year, but of course not all those people die of rheumatic heart disease. You can die of other things and still have rheumatic heart disease. In terms of figuring out which ones were caused by rheumatic heart disease, we're probably talking 7 to 10 per year of directly rheumatic heart disease attributable deaths. I haven't shown the data here. The average age of death is in the mid-30s. So this is a young person's disease. It's affecting people and killing people at a young age. Now, so there's a lot more data from the Northern Territory. I'm not going to focus on it. One key point is that we are getting data from other jurisdictions at last, which is wonderful. So there is work on rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease occurring in Queensland, and this is a publication from a few years ago, 3 years ago, by Jeff Hanna and Richard Hazelwood in North Queensland, and documenting a period of 5 years of enhanced surveillance for acute rheumatic fever. And the findings were that there was an incidence of about 61 per 100,000 of acute rheumatic fever in Indigenous people in this region. High rate of recurrences, if you look at the figures so this is about what we were finding in the Northern Territory in the top end before we instituted a control program. And an interesting comment that the incidence of rheumatic fever in North Queensland is considerably lower than that reported from the top end. I don't agree with that conclusion for this reason. You may not be able to read this up the back, and I'll just highlight it for you. The problem is that if you compare apples with apples, which is the incidence of acute rheumatic fever in school-age kids, which is the key point, these are the incidences in the different regions with the total at the bottom. So we're talking incidences between about 100 and 350 per 100,000 per year, with an overall rate of about 162. Actually not that different to what we find in the top end of the Northern Territory. And I'd argue that in the top end we've had a very enhanced surveillance for quite a long period of time. So I think what this data shows us is that there is a problem with rheumatic fever in North Queensland, and it's actually not that different to what's happening here in the Northern Territory, which makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense that there's a particular reason why North Queensland should be all that different. We don't